So here are our learning goals for today. The big ones are to describe what a database is in your own words and with the correct technical terminology, learn how it relates to web applications, be able to describe SQL or SQL. We'll be defining key database vocabulary like table, column, row, primary key, and schema. We'll be using Post2Co to visualize our database. We'll describe what an ORM is and how that relates to the database. And then we will also be using some built-in active record methods to create, read, update, and delete resources in the Rails console. So maybe some of this is starting to sound familiar after last night's homework assignment or from the pre-work, and we're just going to do a deeper dive today. We won't be doing a lot of work in Rails, and this lesson does have like quite a few slides to kind of go over and just get that content out there. It's important to really have a good foundation at the high level of what a database is and what an ORM is and what we need to know about that in the context of being Rails developers and backend developers. So to get started, I'm going to set up some breakout rooms for you all to discuss these two questions. These are the first two questions. They're also listed in the lesson plan under some discussion questions, but I'll post these in the code help channel when I send you out to your breakout rooms. And what I'd like you all to talk about as a group is just what is a database? How would you describe a database based on the knowledge that you have so far? And then the second thing to talk about is thinking back to Mod 1 probably, and any work that you've done with CSV files. Can you find any similarities and differences between a CSV file and how that operates and the structure, et cetera, versus a database? Like, what are the similarities and differences? So give me one moment to get that all set up. Okay, I'm going to give you all maybe a little over 5 minutes. I'm just opening those breakout rooms, and I'll post those two questions in the code help channel for your reference.
Do you want me to drop in on room 5?
Let's see. No, so you don't need, when you get assigned a breakout room, you don't have to. But later on, when they're doing these like activities that are in the lesson plan, I plan to like kind of float around and see if anybody has questions, and maybe I can start at the bottom of the list and you can start at the top. Let me make you co-host actually. So now if you click breakout rooms, do you get to choose which one you go into?
Let's see. Yes.
Sweet. Cool. How's your morning going?
Pretty good. How's yours?
It's good. I kind of got a little bit of a late start, but we're here.
Me too.
We're making it work.
Me too. Me too. I was like, oh no, day 2 of teaching and I'm already scrambling to get to the all hands, you know?
Yeah, know the feeling, but it's all good.
Yeah. What was it I was going to ask you about? Whatever it is, I can talk to you this afternoon. I don't think it was anything big.
Okay.
Just preparing for my lesson on Thursday.
Gotcha. How are you feeling about that?
I think I'm pretty good. Pretty good.
I'm sure it's going to be great.
Yeah. I wanted to ask what like you're using for your deck. Like, are you using a specific program or are you just using
I'm just using Google Slides,
okay.
And let me make a note to myself to remind myself to send you. I copied over all the slide decks that Brian had created like last inning, and some of them like he had created a previous inning and I just changed a little bit, but we have copies of everything we used last time. So I can send you that and you don't have to go off of those at all. But if it helps you get like a jumping off point, I made myself a little note, so hopefully I can send those over to you.
Awesome. Thank you.
No
That
problem.
would be great. I had started to build one and then I was like, I should ask before I get too far down into this.
Cool.
I should ask if they
I
have
like-
one more.
I like Google Slides. I started using it and it worked, so I didn't try anything else, but you can feel free to teach the lesson however you want, really. You don't even have to use slides if you don't want to. Sometimes I don't.
Yeah, it depends on the lesson. I think for this one though, it probably will be useful.
Oh, there's so many slides. I think, and just in general, the week 1 lessons have a ton of content. So yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. But otherwise, I think I feel pretty good. Yeah.
Great.
I got confused weirdly by, what is it, Open Hub?
What's up?
Open Hub.
It's,
Oh my gosh.
oh my gosh, that's why I wanted to meet, because I'm sure
Yeah.
you could like poke around and figure everything out on your own time, but it's very robust and not very intuitive. So I thought maybe we could like go through it together, and I'll show you what I've been like, how I've been using the event types. Yeah, I'm still kind of learning it too, but it's nice to not like, it's nice to have a way for people to sign up where they're not just going, before we were just doing a Google Doc and like, you know, people can overwrite names or like click on the wrong tab.
Fishy stuff, yeah, or mistakes in general.
Mhm.
Yeah, I've used I forgot the one, that's my wife in the other room blowing her nose. It's very loud. I forgot the one, Calendly we were using. And so I'm used to the format, but Once Hub was like, but look at all these extra things you can do.
Bells and whistles. Yeah, there's a lot.
Do I need the extra things? So thank you. I appreciate all your help.
Of course.
Yeah, for sure.
I'm gonna give them a couple more minutes. This is a long class, so.
Yeah, for sure. I think those are all my questions. I think that's it. I'll just be 1 second.
Yeah.
Just letting my wife know, because we have it so that she can use the living room and then I have this desk space, but it's like, understandably, they're always worried if like they could be seen on camera. So I was like, no, it's okay. I was set up.
Yeah. Well, that's nice. It's cool. You have like your own little co-working space in your home.
Yeah, it's working. It's working, except for all the cats that want to come up and knock the computer over. But I'm looking at 2 of them now who are just like, it's a computer.
They're pondering.
Computer there.
Oh man, yeah, I know the struggle. I can't let my cats in here because they think everything is a toy.
Yep.
Right.
I wish I had a door on this room, but that's okay.
Have you tried the thing where you give cats like their own little fake computer, and they're supposed, like, some cats apparently just want to do what you're doing, so they'll mirror you and they'll sit and they'll work on their own little computer too.
No, but I'm gonna look that up. That's amazing.
I hope it works. My cats don't do it. They just like to make my life difficult. So.
They're just there for a whole different reason.
Yeah.
I'm totally gonna look that up now.
Let me know if it works with your cats so I can continue to guilt trip mine.
Probably won't, just because they are very strong-willed, but
Love cats. All right. People are probably back. Yeah. All right. Hi, everybody. So I thought we could discuss these as a group. I would love to hear from some volunteers about what your group talked about for this first question. What is a database? If somebody could raise their hand and share what you discussed, we'll just kind of take notes collectively here. What is a database? Antonio?
Yeah. So we basically just said it's a location where we store information to use in our applications, stores raw data, not objects. And I guess as far as how it compares to CSV files, I guess the simplest way we could put this is functionality. Databases can handle a lot more complex functionality than CSV files, whereas CSV files, I guess, we looked up that somehow they're flat files. Not quite sure how to explain that, but I think it just means there's a lot more work involved when working with the data.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's all accurate. Thank you for sharing. If anybody has maybe ways that they talked about something similar and can elaborate on this more, because I think this is an interesting idea, right? Like, why is it that a database can handle more complex functionality? What is it that makes that? So let's hear from Taylor.
Yeah, along those lines, we had said databases can make use of temporary tables. So you have a query where you've got kind of a temporary data store to analyze and utilize, where in a CSV, you might have to like manually create a pivot table or do a bunch of VLOOKUPs or something like that.
I'll just leave it at that. I think that kind of sums up what you were saying, I hope. Cool. Great, thank you. Can I hear from a different group about, especially this first question, like what else did you take away about a database? How else would you define a database? Anything to add to this here? Let's see.
Oh, whoops.
Oh, Marla, yes.
I don't know if I have like a full-fledged answer to this, but I guess I have more of a question.
Okay.
About like the line between like where a database ends and an ORM begins, like the auto-generating of a primary key, is that something the ORM is doing, or is that something the database is doing?
That's a really good question. We'll be talking more about how those two systems interact later on in the lesson. I think that'll probably clear up a lot of the questions or confusion that might be coming up. But in this case, Postgres is responsible for like the auto sequential IDs, which are our primary keys by default. So that would be something that the database or the database management system is taking care of. But we can we can dig into that a little bit more later on in the lesson. That's a good thing to bring up and be keeping in mind. Thanks.
Okay.
Let's see, Alex K.
A database uses primary and foreign keys to link different tables together.
Gotcha. Yeah, absolutely. So we could say, maybe the way that I would add to that is like databases have a concept of relationships between tables, right? And I'll put your point about the foreign keys and primary keys underneath that. I think that makes sense. So these have a concept of relationships between tables, uses foreign keys and primary keys. Cool. Thanks, Alex. Let's hear from Sammy.
There are different types of databases, like relational, non-relational, object-oriented, distributed.
Yeah,
So you
great
have
point.
a lot more options to organize your data.
Yeah, so let me see if I can capture all that. Relational, non-relational, object-oriented, etc. And maybe here we can make that a point and say with databases, we have more options than we do with CSVs. CSVs are always going to work the same way. Right? Cool. Yeah, let's keep pushing on this a little bit more. I think there are still a couple of groups I haven't heard from. Does anybody have anything to add to this before we move on? What are some, let's see, what else can I think of actually? What about when it comes to editing? Are there differences or similarities with how we manage and edit data between a database and a CSV? Dane?
Yeah, so you access the data in a CSV like directly through the file versus in SQL for the database.
Right. So, and I'll specify here because Sammy brought up a good point that there are lots of different types of databases, but in mod 2, we're going to be talking about relational databases pretty much exclusively. So I'll say in relational databases, we use SQL to make changes. Great, thanks, Dane. Okay, I'll open it up one more time, or until we run out of things to say. Does anybody else have something to add that y'all talked about or found interesting when you were looking into databases over the past few hours? Caroline?
With databases, you can specify like the data type, like Boolean, integer,
Yes.
or string versus CSV, where it's all a string.
Databases can handle different data types. Yeah, very, very good point. Marla?
So I have another question.
Sure.
So for the temporary tables, are we talking about like joins and stuff in SQL with those? Is that what that means?
Yeah, that's one way I would understand a temporary table. I think you could really get into the weeds here and look into like different capabilities of different database management systems, and some of them probably make more use of temporary tables that you can query depending upon what ORM you're using, or if you're just using SQL. But a really like common example would be, hey, I need to get a few records and I need something from this table and something from this table. And the way that SQL will give that information to you if you're just writing in SQL is, okay, I'm going to make a little table with this criteria and basically package it up and send it to you. And then I'm going to wipe that from the memory because we're not storing it in the database, right? And a lot of that is abstracted away from us, even if we're working in raw SQL. When we're working with an ORM, I'd say probably even more so. But yeah, that's a good point. That's pretty much what's happening under the hood, or that's what we would want to understand for this point where we're at in the mod.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so I think this captures pretty much everything I wanted to touch on. These are really good points. With CSV, it's comma separated values. They're all the same data type. You would have to parse that manually if you wanted to get to something. With databases, you can use the SQL language to interact with the data, the raw data, in an easier way. There's less overhead. You can, one thing maybe that we didn't touch on here is that with databases, you can create rules pretty easily about what is and what is not allowed to be stored in the database. So you can have things like database level validations, automation for things like the primary key, sequential order, all that good stuff. So the little illustration I have for that here is I think of it like a Pokemon evolution, even though my Pokemon knowledge is limited to like the pre-COVID Pokemon Go days. You have a CSV that accomplishes this task of structuring your data in like columns and rows, right? And you can store that data so that you can use it later. It can be persisted in your applications. When you like close out your terminal, you don't have to worry about your data going away. It's stored somewhere. And then this concept is taken to the next level with a database where you kind of have the same concept functionally. We have columns and rows and tables of each table represents a different type of object or data. Like if you have an artist table, every entry in that table is going to be an artist, whether you're in a database or a CSV file, right? But when we go to a database, we have so many more tools at our disposal, and it's just more powerful. Cool. I think this is a good place to take a pause before we jump into a bunch of slides. So let's come back at 9:27. Cool, looks like most of us are back. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen over here. So this is just mostly as a recap from what we were all just talking about and brainstorming about together. So a database is an organized collection of data. And data is what powers web applications. I think I gave the example yesterday of Twitter and how boring it would be if everything was static and people couldn't go in and create their own content or delete their tweets or read other people's tweets. I think this is pretty much true of any application or website that you use on the daily. It really needs to be dynamic, and data is what drives that behavior. So when a user uses this web application, their input affects the data in the database, and it's our job as backend developers to be able to handle those changes in those interactions. So databases need a database management system. I've thrown this word around a couple of times, or this phrase around a couple of times already. This governs our interactions with the database. So really, if we're getting very technical about the terminology that we're using, the database is the organized collection of data. It's the data that exists and the way that it's organized. And the database management system is the tool that we use to interact with that data. So in our case, that's PostgreSQL. There are a lot of these. There's SQLite. If you're looking into non-relational databases, there are things like Mongo. Another SQL one is Oracle. There are just so many, especially for SQL because it's been around and used for a long time. And you may hear the DBMS referred to as the database, like in conversation, and that's perfectly okay. So if somebody comes up to us and says, oh, you're working on a Rails app, what are you using for your database? We're probably just going to say Postgres, right? Or PostgreSQL. That's not technically 100% correct. That's the database management system, but just to put that out there that you'll hear the terms used interchangeably, and that's fine. So relational databases, there are other types. We won't cover them. I mentioned a couple just now. We won't cover them in Mod 2, but if that's something you're interested in, there should be opportunities in Mod 3 and beyond to kind of explore some of those newer technologies and maybe even use them in your projects. Relational databases have a strategy for organizing data that we call the schema. When you were working on, or as you're working on your relational Rails project and putting together that visual schema that with the DB Designer website or whatever it's called, that's a visual schema. It's a tool. It's to communicate to somebody looking at your app or to other programmers, whatever, very quickly. Hey, what's the logic behind this database? What tables do we have, and how are they structured? What attributes do these have? And we'll have a schema in our code as well in Rails as we move through this project. But the term schema more generally is just used to describe how, to get to how the database is described. We just call that the schema. So when we're looking at any database schema, we'll have tables. This is the collection of related data. And when we say related data, we mean that they are objects of the same type. So like I said earlier, if you have an artist table, every row in that database or every entry in that database is going to be an artist. Then you might have another table called songs, and then you won't have any data about artists on the songs table, except maybe a foreign key, which we'll get to in later lessons. But the idea is every table holds that type of data. The data is related. You may also hear this called a resource. And this will become more relevant as we get later into the mod and we start using certain types of syntax for our URLs in our application. We'll talk about resources more then. But for now, the important takeaway is that a resource is like saying, oh, there's a song resource that I want my page to go to. That's kind of what we're talking about. We're talking about something in the database. Another example would be tasks in Task Manager. And you can think of these as the nouns of your application. So like the thing that I'm trying to create, read, update, or delete is likely going to be a table in the database. So we already mentioned that tables have columns and rows. A row is an entry in the table, and we also call this a record. So my first artist record would probably be an artist with the ID of 1 in the artist table. And then the column is the attributes of a resource. So tasks have a title and a description. Title and description are the columns, and every row in that table will be a record that has a value for a title and a value for a description. Okay, I think I'll go through probably primary keys and then pause for any questions that are coming up before we go into SQL stuff specifically. So every table is going to have an ID column. We say typically here because technically it's possible to go in and change this so that your records don't have an ID column. Maybe they have something else. But this is, you can think of this as always. Every table will have an ID column, and we want every table to have an ID column. This is how we uniquely identify each row or each record in the table. This is called a primary key. We wouldn't want our primary key to be something like name or title for the task, because you could see a world where maybe two tasks have the same title. The primary keys are taken care of for us with Postgres pretty seamlessly. It will automatically increment them and keep counting upwards. It'll maintain that data integrity, and every single one will be unique as well as indexed, which not important to really understand indexing in detail right now, but suffice to say that SQL will be able to look things up by the primary key because they are indexed. It's just easier for SQL to grab those records more efficiently. All right, any questions so far coming up for y'all? Matt K.
It was mentioned that the information in a table is all, well, inside of a database is all relational. So is that always the case, even if the database itself is not relational?
No, we're talking specifically about relational databases in this lesson.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes. So the point of a relational database is to be able to relate different records together. So for instance, we'll get into creating a song that belongs to an artist, and then that song will have a foreign key of the artist ID. So you'll know which artist that song belongs to. In a relational database, that's not really my wheelhouse. I can't speak to it as much, but there is not nearly as much structure around how things are tied together in a non-relational database. So yeah, that just has to do with the types of databases that we'll be working with in Mod 2, which are relational. Good question. What other questions do y'all have so far? All right, let's move on to some more talk about SQL. SQL stands for structured query language. You might hear it said SQL or SQL. I don't really have an opinion about a correct way, but that might differ from person to person. Either is fine, but it stands for structured query language, meaning that we use this language to query relational databases. We might be asking for some information. We might be looking to make some changes. We might be doing CRUD. So we might be doing create, read, update, and delete. We can also do data analysis with SQL very easily. So for instance, maybe we have a storefront app and we want to know which merchants have generated the most revenue. Maybe we want to display them as featured or something on our website. And SQL is a really good tool for getting that business logic accomplished and doing this data analysis. Maybe another is which shelters have the fewest pets. This would be another great thing to do with SQL or with our ORM, which we'll get to later. But SQL is what makes it possible for us to do this without having to go manually parse something and write code to crunch these numbers. SQL is also used to alter the database schema. So if you think back, the schema is the set of rules or instructions about how the database is set up and organized. And if we want to change that, like change a column name maybe, or add a column to a table or remove a column from a table, SQL is what makes it possible to alter that schema. Cool. So I have been talking a lot, and now we have an activity that I'll send you all out to do. This is in the lesson plan, which I'm going to just drop into, I think I'll drop it into the Zoom chat. One moment. And I will also go over here. Ooh. 1 second. You all can still see my screen okay, right? Cool. All right, so this post-to-go activity, I'll send you out into the same breakout rooms, and I'd like everybody to complete this activity on their own machine. But with the breakout rooms, we're hoping that you can discuss any issues that come up amongst yourselves, or maybe compare results, compare answers, and just have a little bit of discussion and collaboration, even though you'll be working on this on your own machine. We're going to be using Postico and going up into till the extensions. Of course, if you have extra time before I close out the breakout room, feel free to go through the extensions, but maybe check in with your group first, with your breakout room. And before I send you all out to do this, I want to walk through getting Postico up and running, just to make sure nobody has any like setup or configuration issues. If you are not able to follow along with me for any reason, if you run into an error, hang back from the breakout rooms and we'll help you troubleshoot. But I'll give everybody a second to just kind of get ready to follow along with me as we go through, just getting into Postico and looking at these tables. So I'm going to go into the fuzzy finder and open up Postico. Here you might first see something like this, where you have like a nickname and a port and your user. You shouldn't have to change any of these things. You can just click connect. And then that should drop you here into this Postico interface, where you can click on your little localhost elephant where your username is. So right here, I had my username Jameson, but if I click on the localhost, it will actually take me back to where all my databases are. And I'm going to have more databases than you in most cases. But what I'm looking for here is to be able to click on the Task Manager Development Database or the Task Manager Test Database. And when I get in here, I should be able to do a couple of things like click on tasks and see if I have any in here. Right now, I don't have any tasks in my table. You can also click on the SQL query icon and come in here and write some raw SQL. That is where I'll leave it. And let me open up those breakout rooms. Again, if you had trouble getting to this point, no worries. We will help you troubleshoot your Postico. You can hang back before going to your breakout room. Does anybody have questions about the activity before I open those rooms? Okay. Great. I'll see you all probably in 15 to 20 minutes. Hi, Karina. Did you have an issue?
Well, I go to open it and it just is spinning.
Can you share your screen so we can all be looking at it?
Yeah. So if I go here and click that, it like just spins up here and isn't doing
Interesting.
anything. So I don't know if you need, I don't know.
Yeah, my first guess would be to like close out Postico and like quit Postico and then try again.
So if I can't click up here, what would be a good way to force quit that, I guess?
Is it Command Shift Q? That'll kind of quit all applications.
Okay.
And you can like then restart.
Okay, I will try that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let us know if that doesn't work though.
Okay, thanks.
Did you run into that too, Kelly? I've never seen it.
No, not yet, but I did want to ask because my Postico is like the free trial. Do we have a like a company one, or do we just use the free trial? Okay.
Not that I know of. I ignore it every time it asks me to give them money when I close out. We only really use it like in week one to kind of, or at least the way I've been using it is just to get some eyes on what a database looks like.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's fine. Yeah, I used to have a whatever account, but that's a long time ago. Cool. I'm gonna give them a couple minutes, and then is this the one we should start dropping in on?
Yeah, I think so. Would you like to start from the top in like room 1, and I'll start in room 8? Yeah, and I'll just keep an eye on where you're hanging out. And I'll probably give them another 5 minutes to get started. But yeah.
Sounds good. I'll just go use the bathroom real fast then. See.
All right. All set?
Yep, that worked.
Awesome, glad.
I don't know if
I'm looking, actually, do you remember what breakout room you were in?
were they the same ones from the prior breakout?
Yeah.
I was with Jacob P and Alex K.
All right, thank you. I can move you back there.
Thanks.
No problem. See you later.
Oh, Antonio, are we being recorded?
Then you, it's SQL query tool, which is above those. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then on the top there, you just type your SQL query, and then on the bottom, it displays what your query is actually going to generate. So like if you did select asterisk from tasks, that's going to show you your whole table.
And then the semicolon at the end.
Yeah, I'm so bad about that.
I forget sometimes too.
Ooh,
Hi, everyone. How's it going?
Hi,
Good.
good.
I'm just checking in to see how far people are in the activity, so I can bring you back at a reasonable time. Any questions coming up or anything?
well, I've just popped into my task manager directory and opened SQLite 3, and that's the stage that I'm at.
Yeah, so we are retrieving all tasks. I believe all of us are on that step.
Got it. Sounds good. Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add, but y'all can call us if you have any questions that come up.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
Technically, it would be two databases because you have the test one and then like you have your regular one. I think you see that. I believe.
Okay. Within the task manager development, or is task manager development or, oh yeah, I see what you're saying. Yes.
I think it's just talking about just like the base when you're on your local host, like how many databases you will have.
Uh-huh. Yeah, so task manager development and task manager tests. Yeah, like you said, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you run like Rails DB create, it creates like development and task each time.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
PG catalog.
Hi, all. Just checking in with some people to see how's it going and how far in the activity have you gotten, so they bring me back at a good time.
It's going well. I'm nearly through the first section.
Cool.
Yeah, I was just looking at the questions.
Great. Any questions coming up that I can answer before I hop out?
For the syntax of looking up like specific titles, like how it has to look up laundry, it looks like on mine it worked when it was a single quote instead of a double quote. Does that make a difference?
Yeah, I think that when you're writing the SQL queries, you're going to need to use single quotes.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'll see you all in a little bit.
Great, thanks.
Hi, y'all. How's everything going?
Making some progress, I think.
Awesome.
A little slowly.
I think
but-
okay.
That's fine.
Yeah.
Out of curiosity, about where are you at in the activity?
I just got to trying to retrieve the task with the laundry title.
Cool.
Yeah, I'm changing one of the attributes right now.
Awesome.
I don't have this database. I'm trying to create.
Oh, you haven't created a task manager?
Yeah,
database?
well, it's a long story, but I deleted, like I had to reinstall a lot of things, and so I
Right.
deleted that back.
Okay.
So
Yeah, no worries if you can't like recreate the whole database and get all that taken care of during this activity. That's understandable.
I'm just trying to do them without it. So.
Okay. If any questions come up, y'all can call one of us and we'll drop in. See you in a bit.
Thank you.
Sorry, you had it on and then you had it off. But I'll
my bad. I was just gonna see how people were doing. Was it all
and they're
good?
doing good. They seem to be doing good. I sent you a message.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
That seems about right to me. But cool. See you in a bit. All right. Hi, everybody. I hope everybody got to take a palm. Yeah. Did everybody build it? Okay. Yeah, sometimes these broadcast messages don't work the way I expect them to. So let's take a quick palm. Let's be back at 10:08 and then address any questions that came up during that activity. We'll give people a little bit more time to get back, but start thinking through any questions that came up during that activity. We'll spend a little bit of time here answering those and going over the questions you discussed. Yeah. All right, as people are making their way back in, could I hear from somebody in room 1? So that was Caroline, Dane, Dee, and Taylor. How many databases did y'all see in Postico?
We saw 2 databases, test and development.
Awesome, thanks. That seems like what I would expect most people to see. Could I hear from someone in room 8, Antonio, Brian, and Michael? Why do you think there is a task manager development and a task manager test database?
So we had actually a pretty long discussion about this. So what we ended up theorizing was that test would sort of be almost like a fixture database that we developed to test if, edge cases that don't necessarily exist in our real database, just to make sure that we're catching them. So that's what we came up with. The development was probably going to be the actual database, and test would be sort of a fixture.
Great, thank you. I definitely like the direction that y'all are thinking in. And yeah, this idea of having different environments with different sets of data, testing is going to have a different use case than data that we're interacting with in the browser, right? So that all makes sense to me. I think there's like maybe more to be said there, but I'll hold off. Does anybody else have anything to add about that question? Why were there two databases? Anybody to add to what Brian and that group talked about? Open to any group. Seems like probably people came to similar conclusions. And what I'll say there before we move on is that's pretty close to accurate. What I will add is that development isn't necessarily going to be in the grand scheme of things as we think to the apps that we'll be building in Montu. Development is just that. It's for when you're developing your application. So if you're going into your browser and testing things manually, looking around, seeing what happens if you click on buttons and stuff, that would be using data from your development database. In a minute, we'll be using something called Rails console, and that also accesses your development database and your test database. If you remember from the model testing lesson yesterday, how I had to set up an actual record to call the method on in my test, the test database will create things as your tests run and then tear down all those records after your tests run. So typically, if you clicked on it today and you were exploring, you may have seen that it didn't have anything in it, and that's usually what we expect. Later on, we'll get into probably not as much in Montu, but something to be aware of is that you have your test database, you have your development database, and eventually you'll be thinking in terms of a production database. So almost like the stage of a play. Production is where it's actually happening and in front of people. So that would be real users' data. Right, okay, thanks. Let's see. Yeah, let's take some time. What questions came up for y'all during that activity? Anything at all? Because after this, we'll be going into discussion about ORMs. So I want to make sure that we get really clear on anything that came up. Yeah, Matt.
We noticed in our group that it wasn't necessary to use the syntactical convention of capitalizing the query commands. And I was wondering if that was unique to Postico or if that is shared and won't negatively affect our queries.
Gotcha. Yeah. Did anybody else experiment with that at all, with the capitalization in your SQL queries? Or did anybody else notice something similar? Just out of curiosity. Yeah, as far as I know, the capitalization with SQL queries is conventional. So it's really for people reading the SQL or writing the SQL to be able to tell the difference between like the table names, which typically are lowercase, and like the things associated, like the column names or table names, et cetera, versus the commands in SQL like select or group by, those would be in caps. But as far as I know, at least in Postgres and in Postco and in the PSQL command you can run in the console, which we haven't gotten to yet, it's not required. It's just convention. The capitalization specifically. There are other syntax things that are required. Yeah. Did that answer your question, Matt? Gunnar.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Cool.
Hi. I was curious on the last question of why isn't there any data in the task manager test database? And I was actually curious about that as well, because when you look at the taskspec.rb, you are doing task one and like task.create. And I do know when you do make things in the test or in the test file, usually it saves to the test database. So I was just curious about that.
Yeah, definitely. I think that brings up an interesting point, and maybe it would be worth taking a closer look. Do you have your text editor open by any chance, Gunnar? Could you share your screen?
I do have it open.
Cool. Let's just try a little experiment and see if we can demonstrate this. Great. Before we do anything here in your text editor, do you mind opening up your Postico and showing me what you were referring to, where the task manager test database is empty? Right. So we see here we're in task manager test, and you do not have any tasks in this table. Cool. Can we go back over to your text editor and let's put a binding.pry after one of these tests, or yeah, not after, sorry, in one of these tests after you've created a record. And now could you run your tests and then take a look at the pry?
I think I have something going on. I think that's why, maybe.
Gotcha. So what I was hoping to demonstrate, if you go back over to your text editor, this might be something that I'd recommend trying on your own time, like if anybody's interested in why this behaves the way that it does. What I would expect to happen on line 19 is you would hit your binding.pry, and you would be able to say, at that point, you're basically in a pry session, an IRB session, whatever you want to call it, in your test environment, in your terminal, right? And then you can say capital T task.all, and you should see the tasks that you created on line 17 and 18, those should show up. Now, what I don't know is if you were to open Postico at that point, if they would show up in the in that table, in that database that was empty. It would be interesting to see if they did show up there. But then when you continue out of your test, I would expect the Postico database for Task Manager test to be empty. And that's because the test, your test suite, RSpec, will create these records, but then it will wipe them from memory once the tests are done running. And that's expected behavior. But yeah, thank you for like demonstrating what you were seeing. I think that'd be something interesting to experiment with on your own time.
Awesome, thank you.
No problem. Brian?
So I was following along with when Gunnar was saying that, and just to clarify what we're saying with the test database itself. So each test itself is going to input all the data, like this task.create, all that's going to get thrown into this Task Manager test database, get tested, and then get deleted for the next test. This is a sort of a blank slate for the test to exist. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's accurate. And as you're writing tests, you may notice that, well, we haven't really gotten into this yet, but you may already be familiar with something similar in RSpec. I'm not really sure if you get into this in mod 1, but you could use something like a before each block in your, this is bringing bells, right? So it behaves the same way. You would need to use a before each block and set up your tests with instance variables for those to be available throughout your it blocks, because otherwise the local variables are limited in scope to the it block. And it's because of this behavior. Now we could like have a whole conversation about what that looks like in Ruby versus what we're using here with a Postgres database, but I think that probably covers what we need to know for now. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Awesome. Taylor?
Yeah, and along those lines, sorry if I missed this, but is the bang operator in the .create method what automatically deletes those tasks, or is it just done automatically through RSpec?
That's a good question, but the latter, it's done automatically through RSpec. The bang is for a different reason, and I'll mention it now, but we'll cover it again later. We recommend using the bang in creating and updating in your tests, because that way, if something in that operation fails, for instance, if it's unable to create a task for you to test with, it will fail on that line, and it will give you a useful message like couldn't create task without such and such, or whatever the error is. And then that way you're not troubleshooting something in your test. It's not like you're troubleshooting the right thing in your test, because if the record never got created and you have a failure later on, that can be really confusing. So that's why we recommend that you use the bang for create and update operations in your tests.
Got it. Thank you.
No problem. What other questions do y'all have? Brian, is your hand up from before? Or?
Well, it was, yeah, but actually I just got another one.
Right,
so
let's do it.
For the data to get generated in that test database, sorry, I'm sort of stuck on this one. So
okay.
For the data to actually go over there, do we need to be running Rails S for the server to then push it over?
Yeah, that brings up a good point. Rails S will be running your local server, which you can think of as part of your development environment.
Okay, so that's nothing to do with the test one.
Exactly.
Because I was trying to do what Gunnar was saying, where, like when he was going through that, and I was like, okay, so halfway through this test, if you pry in, you should expect to see that task as a row, but I don't. And so I'm trying to figure out where the data goes for the actual test itself. Right.
So that's what I think. Maybe it might be worth, let's take just a couple more minutes. Do you mind sharing your screen, Brian? I want to make sure we're on the same page. I wasn't sure. That's what I was kind of looking to see, is if you got to this pry, would your Postico test database have anything in it? I don't know if it's that responsive, but as you can see here, can you focus on your terminal, please?
Sure.
You called task.all, and you do see that you have tasks available, right? You have this one that you created. So that is that would be kind of your source of truth. And I mean, we could try it. Do you mind quitting Postico, like going to like the navigation? Yeah, and quit Postico, and then maybe open it again while you still have this pry open. This might not work, but it would be interesting if it did. And now if you, yeah, click on your test. No, so Postico probably isn't quite robust enough to see that change happening in real time, but it suffice to say that it will basically always be empty when we look at it in Postico, because that's really what we want from our test database. We want it to be very temporary so that we can test specific things and then get rid of that data and not clog up our memory or have any unexpected behavior by like changing those records around in future tests, if that makes sense.
Okay, yeah.
Right, so yeah, if you are in that pry and the task is showing up in your terminal, that's a sign to you that, yeah, it does exist in your test environment until the test ends.
Okay.
Cool, thanks for sharing. No problem. Yeah, let's go to Lee.
My test database actually does have a line.
Interesting. I've seen that can happen sometimes. What I'll say about that, I don't want to spend too much time here for the sake of getting through the rest of the lesson plan, but what I'll say is when I've seen that happen when you have something in Postico in your test database, usually it's not really an issue. Maybe it got into a weird state, but if you start having issues with like sequential IDs, like if you get some error message that speaks to that when you're running your tests, it might be worth dropping and recreating your database or doing like a test database reset. You can find some Stack Overflow posts and stuff that speak to that. But if it doesn't cause any issues, it probably is just like some weird thing happened with Postico while you were experimenting. And it can definitely, I've seen it happen because people go into the test database and start experimenting and adding records with the graphic interface rather than doing that in the development database. But I don't know, it could be for some other reason. If it gives you any trouble, definitely let us know.
Cool.
Scott?
Yep, I know we spent a lot of time here, but just a quick question. So using that prize session, I was looking at the tasks and it looks like the task ID numbers keep increasing and don't reset. Is that normal?
For the test database specifically,
Yeah.
right? So what I'm hearing and what I'm guessing you might be seeing is like you have task 1, 2, 3, and then you run some more tests, and then you have task 4, 5, 6. That's expected behavior. That's Postgres trying to protect you with sequential IDs. It's trying to be very smart about that because you can see a world where maybe you are doing something with a specific task in your code, and then later it tries to grab the same one, and now you've overwritten what used to be task number 2 with a new task, and then it gets all out of whack because it wasn't the expected behavior for that. So if a record is deleted or destroyed, Postico will continue to increment because the ID will always be unique for any record that has ever existed in that table.
Gotcha. Awesome.
Cool.
Thanks.
No problem. Let's keep moving along here. I have a few more slides to get through and we have another activity. And if there are more questions that we didn't get to just now, I'm happy to take those during office hours. So give me 1 second to get arranged here. Okay, so we finished the Postico activity. Please hold. All right. So moving on to the idea of an ORM. What is an ORM? ORM stands for Object Relational Mapper. This transforms the raw data in our database into objects that we can interact with in an object-oriented programming language. So in our case, we'll be working in Ruby and Ruby on Rails. Our ORM is active record, and it will be taking these rows of SQL data and changing them into Ruby objects that are easier for us to work with. And the reasons that we use an ORM is, I mean, the big one is that working with objects is easier. If you think about the conventions that you learned in Mod 1 about line length and method length and all this stuff, imagine if you had to use raw SQL in your Ruby methods. It would be really difficult to meet those conventions or even write readable code by writing raw SQL in the middle of all of our Ruby, right? So when we are working with objects, it's more like working with the types of objects that you were making, like plain old Ruby objects, except now we have this translator between our app and our database, that is talking to the database and getting the raw data and then giving back some Ruby objects that we can work with. Another advantage of an ORM is that it's database agnostic. So your Rails app is completely separate from your database, and you could maybe see a world where you're building Task Manager and you have all the code written and it's working great and your tests are passing, and then your product manager comes up to you and says, we decided we don't want to use Postgres, we want to use SQLite. Well, no big deal. If you're using Active Record, you can change your database, you can change your database management system and keep all of your Active Record the same, because the ORM is database agnostic. It doesn't matter. It doesn't really care what database you plug it into, as long as it's SQL. And then another advantage is security. We won't go into a lot of detail about this, but it's good to know that Active Record protects us from some common types of attacks on web applications, such as SQL injections. So there are ways to like get a whole table to drop by trying to submit a form with some raw SQL in it to basically say, hey, drop this whole database. And with Active Record, we have another layer of protection, just kind of for free, that will protect from some of those more common attacks. So what is Active Record specifically? It's a Ruby ORM. It translates raw data into Ruby objects. And in Rails, this means we create Active Record models. So models must inherit from Active Record base. And we saw this very briefly yesterday. It'll look something like this, where we have our model. I should probably annotate for this. We have our model here, and this is a Ruby class that inherits from something called application record. If you were to go into Task Manager and look for application record, you would find what we have here on top, class application record, which inherits from Active Record base. And any class that inherits from application record for this reason will have the behavior of an Active Record model. You'll be able to call Active Record built-in methods on it. You should be able to use it to query the database to get records of that type. So for instance, in the terminal, when we saw task.all, .all is an Active Record method that is included in our task model because our task class inherits from Active Record. So that's where that behavior comes from. And any model that you have defined should also be a table in your database. Those should be one-to-one. Marla? Oops.
So why is it having to inherit through like multiple layers? Like, why can't you just have task inherit directly from Active Record?
Yeah, from Active Record base. Like, why isn't task inheriting from Active Record base?
Yeah, instead of from application record.
There are a couple of reasons, probably more reasons than I can think of off the top of my head, really, because this is just part of how the Active Record architecture has been designed. But one thing you'll notice here is the online to self.abstract class equals true. I'm not going to get into exactly what that does or why it's here, but imagine a world, we'll have a lesson on this later in the mod, but imagine a world where you want to be able to, maybe you have an app with artists and songs, and you want to be able to sort the artists by their most recently created date. And you also want to be able to order the songs by their most recently created date. Well, that's shared behavior. And to dry up your code, you could make an argument that that code belongs in the application record class because every model in your project is inheriting from it. Active Record base is probably further than we want to go in that chain for writing our own custom code. That's, you know, where the Active Record methods that we'll be calling on our models, that's where all that stuff lives. But application record is kind of this nice way for us to define our own shared behavior across models.
Okay, so we can modify that class. Basically, we can add methods to it that other classes could then inherit later.
Yep, exactly.
Okay, cool.
And
thank you.
Sure, no problem. And just to be clear, that's probably not something that you'll have a need for. So if this isn't quite making sense or seeming useful yet, that's okay. Like, I don't expect anybody to go and refactor their code to use inheritance with application record. That's just one potential benefit of it being set up this way.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
No problem. Any other questions before I keep going? Okay, let's try to pull through on these slides and take a poem. So yeah, let's go through these slides and then we'll do a Rails console activity after we get back. Yes, I think we will need to take a poem before the activity. Yeah. So Rails console, this is something that we have given to us for free when we are using Ruby on Rails. You can run Rails console or Rails C from the command line. This is kind of similar to running Rails server or Rails S. They're using the same environment, but when you're running Rails server, that's starting your server. So you can go to your browser and hit the server and get responses back and interact with your web application in that way. Running Rails console or Rails C will open up REPL similar to Pry. And REPL, I believe that's read, evaluate, print loop. So if you're familiar with Pry, which we try to get everybody started on pretty early, or if you've ever used interactive Ruby, IRB, this is essentially what you're accessing with the Rails console. So this, you could open up I think of it almost as like an open-ended Pry at any point. By running Rails C, this will load your application, including your models. So you will be able to just go to your terminal, type in Rails C, and then see what you have available to you. For instance, you can try task.all, or you could try task.find and then pass it an ID. And you can experiment with those methods that you have defined on your models, either through default active record behavior or whatever custom behavior you've written on the models. So it's a really nice sandbox to just go in and try things out. It's really useful for interacting with your models. The next thing that we'll be doing is a Rails console activity. So this will be further down in the lesson plan, and same as before, I want everybody to be completing these tasks on their own, and there will be discussion questions for you to talk about as a group. Let's see, let me open that up. So here's where we are in the lesson plan. So yeah, just reading through this quickly, you'll open Post-to-Co, double check you delete anything that you created in the Post-to-Co activity earlier, and then you'll make sure that you're in your task manager directory, the root directory of that project, and then opening up Rails console in your terminal by running Rails C. And then there are a few other like prompts and activities here for you to complete. So I think what I would like to do, I'm not sure if maybe some people, I don't know if this is like the most ideal time for a POM or not, but what I'll do is I'll open up the breakout rooms and I'll ask everybody to build in your own POM, figure that out with your group when you would like to take a little break and step away. And we'll come back together, I think at 10:45, 10:50, somewhere around there to try to give you all time to work through these on your own, and then discuss however far you get in these checks for understanding, discuss these questions with your group. Yeah, any questions about the Rails console activity before I open up your breakout rooms? Okay, please remember to build in a POM, get a break, stretch your legs, drink some water, whatever you need to do, and we'll come back here sometime before 10:50. Yeah, Antonio.
Yeah, we had a question towards the end there, like with the difference between task.new and task.create, what is the point of new if you're not going to save it?
Yeah, I guess I have, I'll answer your question with a question. Where do we get the .new method from?
Like instantiating a class, or when a class is instantiated, so.
Yeah, exactly. So if you think back, maybe some people remember using .new to create a new instance of a class in just regular Ruby, right? So we actually get the .new from Ruby, and save and create. Those are active record methods that are new with having active record in our project. So we'll get into this in another lesson, what some of the advantages might be to instantiating an object without saving it or saving it later on. Usually that has to do with how you want to handle errors and validations and stuff. That's just a little bit beyond what we're talking about today. But I think the important thing to remember here is that create is just a combination of new and save.
Thanks.
No problem. Matt?
Yes, it seems like the difference between new and create is a little clearer than my group had been able to understand before, based on your answer just now. But looking at the number 6 and 7 in the Rails console activity, running task.update and task.destroy, I think that what threw us a little bit, even though we were able to get to the end of the exercise for the most part, was that it seems like we're opening a query, or I don't know if that's the correct terminology for it, and then closing it with something. And so certain methods were more, you're starting an activity and then completing it, whereas create just did something all in one go. So I suppose, to iron out my question a little bit more, when you run task.update, is that kind of like a get method, where running task.destroy is what you're feeding into that method to complete it?
I'm not sure I'm completely, I think I kind of understand what you're asking, but I'm not sure I'm completely following your question. I want to make sure I'm understanding. So can you go into like more detail? Was there some behavior that you saw when you were using update and destroy that you didn't expect? Like, could you speak to that a little bit more?
Well, what I experienced was that task.update, it didn't exactly do anything, but then when I ran task.destroy, it applied to that one with the matching description. So what my question was asking was if task.destroy, like possibly several other commands that I could have given, are fed into that resource that was found.
Yeah. So
using task.update.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you for expanding on that. I think there's a very good chance what you're observing there is a little bit of nuance between the local variable that you've set up that Ruby is tracking, which is probably lowercase task, right? Maybe that's what you set the variable
Yes.
to. And when you run update, that's going to go complete some SQL, but your Ruby object, the local variable, might not reflect those changes yet. Whereas destroy is, as I would like imply, more destructive. And I think that change would take quicker. And I think that's just like a little bit of nuance between how Ruby and Active Record are working together. Yeah, the other thing I'll like put on y'all's radar is if you're working in like your tests, for example, and you notice that you have a local variable for an object that you expect to have changed by something that you did in your code or in the test and it hasn't changed, you might need to use the command reload to basically tell Ruby, hey, that thing that you're storing in that variable, make sure it's still in the same state as the object in the database. So I think that's what you're running into. And maybe if we have extra time, we can circle back and look at an example on your screen if that works.
I don't know that it would show anything that wasn't supposed to be on the screen.
No, no worries. Yeah.
But you did help with your answer. Thank you.
Okay, I'm glad. Yeah, if we have extra time, we can definitely like circle back to that discussion. Good question. Brian.
So I didn't do this perfectly, and I think it actually worked to my advantage. So I didn't delete the tasks I made during the post-it-co activity. And so when I went to do whatever task.create, I was getting record not unique error, which was great. So I saw this because eventually it just kept auto generating to the next one until I got to a key I hadn't used yet, and then it made it, which it took 3 times to get there. But my question was about in the console itself, where it says like begin, and then it's got the SQL command that comes after your active record method. And then afterwards, normally it will say commit, but here it was saying rollback, which I understand that would go back to where it was until it keep trying. I guess I'm wondering like what, like commit, is that like once it validates the data first, then it can push it over? Is that the general idea?
Yeah, exactly. So is this ringing bells for people? Did you see something similar when you were working in Rails console where you saw like a commit insert into and then you saw a bunch of SQL, or maybe it failed and you saw the rollback? Yeah, that's a good description of it, Brian. I think you hit the nail on the head. what was I going to say about that? Yes, so the the reason we asked you all to delete those records and then move on to the Rails console activity was for that bug that you ran into. If you are creating things manually in the graphic interface of Postico, and then you try and go do it the quote unquote like standard way, like the way that we normally will, which is using Rails console or using our code, then Postgres gets a little confused because it usually when we're going to be creating and updating data, we're not using Postico. That's just kind of a tool that we introduced in week 1 so that you all can kind of get a visualization of what's happening in the database. So that's why, just to kind of like expand on why you ran into that issue. But yes, as to your actual question, the terminology like commit and rollback, those are indicators that SQL was or was not able to do the operation you asked it to do.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. And so in practice, we're never really going to be updating our databases via Postico.
Correct. I think that's, yeah, I wouldn't recommend it. It's definitely, it can be useful to open up Postico and see what you have, especially if you're noticing like weird behavior in your development environment. But typically we don't want to be changing things in the database using Postico. It's just for visualization.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
No problem. Let's go to Corinna.
So we were going through the questions and I think maybe kind of got to what a model is in Rails application, but can you articulate that a little bit for us on what exactly that is?
Yeah, sure. And I'll mention a little bit about the model view controller design pattern, but if it doesn't make sense today, that's perfectly all right. We'll have actual classes on that later. But in Rails, it follows the MVC pattern, and the M stands for model, V is for view, C is for controller. And you probably remember some of those things from Task Manager. And model is a Ruby object that represents data that is stored in our database. So every row in the tasks table, for instance, would be an instance of a model, of a task model. So the models that you have in the models directory of your Rails app and the tables that you have in your database, those should be one-to-one. So if you have a task.rb file that contains class task inherits from application record, that's saying, hey, this is an active record object. This is something that I'm defining how it should be represented in Ruby. And this is a representation of a piece of data that is stored in the database. Any follow-up on that, Corinna? Okay.
No, I think that was good. Thanks.
Great, no problem. Antonio.
Yeah. What was my question? Oh, so Ruby or Rails console, that's not a safe space really, right? Like IRB and Pry, typically you can test a lot of things, but it looks like we're making permanent changes, right? Or
that's correct. Yes. So going into Rails console is the same as hitting a pry in your development environment. So if you put a binding.pry in like a controller and then you loaded a page and hit the pry, you'd be in the same environment as if you opened up Rails console. It'll load up all of your models in your development environment and let you make changes to them. So yes, those changes are permanent. Like if you update an instance of a task and you change the description, it will update in the database. That will be like it'll be destructive in that it changes it and persists that change. That being said, when we're thinking about it, like, is it safe to change things here? In mod 2, there are very few things you could do to really like get yourself into trouble with like making permanent changes in Rails console. And that goes back to the idea of having different environments to work in, right? So we have our test environment, which is just for running our automated tests. And we have our development environment, which is for more of like browser driven development and that kind of thing. And there may be instances where you want to go in and you want to persist some changes. And then where you would really want to be careful using Rails console, and we won't get into this in mod 2, but there are ways to use Rails console in your production environment. And that's where it would be very dangerous because that would be real users' data. But in the development environment, it will persist your changes. I also wouldn't worry about it too much.
Sweet, thanks.
Sure. Taylor?
was hoping to just grab a screenshot of that diagram if possible.
Oh,
I
yeah.
wasn't fast enough. Sorry.
No, absolutely. I'll do that now and put it in code help
Thank
before
you.
I forget. Yeah. While I'm doing that, Dane, did you also have a question?
Yeah, I actually just want to ask a question before I got to my actual question.
Okay.
Off of Antonio's question, is that to say that you can edit a table or database in 3 different ways? You can do it in Rails, like in the terminal. You could do it like actually in the post ICO, or another way, maybe 2.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there may be more that I'm not considering just because I mostly think in the context of mod 2 all the time. But yeah, you're right. You could change it in Rails console. That would be a persistent change. You could change it in Postico, which I don't recommend, but it is possible. You could set up, and this is like really the meat of our Rails applications, right? Where you could set up an interaction in your browser, which will cause those changes. You define the code that runs the updates or runs the destroy or whatever. So you could do browser-driven development by going to localhost and clicking some buttons or submitting a form, and then that will change your data. Yeah, and that's all that comes to mind immediately. Technically, you could also get into Postgres directly from your terminal without using Rails console, and you could run updates there. That's probably safer than using Postico, but still not something we'll explore in a lot of detail.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
My question was actually related to the number 7 in the activity, the destroy. When I initially did the destroy, it didn't actually like save like an IRB main, etc. task.destroy. It just kind of did it and then deleted like that instance of when I actually input the command. And then later I expected it to, like if I did task.destroy again, I was figuring that it would delete the next lineup, and it didn't do that.
Interesting.
And I was wondering why.
Do you have any of that open? Like, could we maybe walk through it as a group? I think this this could be relevant for a few people.
Definitely.
Thank you. And I would love it if you could walk through what you were describing again and just kind of show us that behavior.
Yeah. So I ran through the task.save, and then down here, the delete happened, the destroy happened, like here. There should be like a command, I'm guessing here, as there is like for the save and for the find, etc. But it's not up here. I was wondering why that happened.
I'm kind of just taking a stab at this, so don't necessarily quote me. I'm not super informed about how IRB does what it does, but my best guess as to why you're seeing different output for the like IRB main and then these numbers has to do with, like, again, the difference between calling an active record command and doing some SQL under the hood and actually doing something that Ruby recognizes as, oh, I need to give you some feedback for this. So I guess now what I would be curious about, you saved that task to the local variable lowercase task, and then you destroyed that one. So are you still in this Rails console session if you scroll down?
Oh, down here, yeah.
Yeah.
So I tried to do it again down here, and that's what I was
Right.
talking about. It just said begin commit immediate, and then didn't do anything.
Yeah,
and it referenced the
interesting.
deleted ID instead of, which is not on my thing anymore.
Right. So could you just type in task, lowercase task? Yeah. And what I think is happening here is that Ruby is not yet aware, or like your environment, your IRB session is not yet aware that this active record object has been destroyed. It's still hanging on to it in local memory. That's what I would say about that. And then I don't remember if this works. Can you try just typing in reload with a bang? I don't remember if this works in, yeah. So now if you do lowercase task, oh no, it still has it. I'm sorry, I don't have more detail as to why that happens exactly, but I do think it has something to do with like the local variable being stored, and it hasn't been garbage collected yet. But everything seems to be working how I would expect, because you don't see that task with an ID of 3 in your post-to-co, right? Yeah, I don't know if that was a great answer, but it was an interesting experiment. If you try to call task.destroy again, my guess is why you have the begin commit and nothing in there is because, yeah, you have that local variable. And if you type in task in your Rails console, it knows what you're talking about. But yeah, my best guess is that it tries to go execute that SQL, and SQL says, I don't know, I already just like, it's not here. I can't do anything, you know?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much.
Sure. Thanks for sharing. Could you take your screen down, Dave?
I'm trying.
Oh, okay. I didn't know if, yeah. No, take your time. It's a good question. I feel like there should be a stop share. Yeah. No rush. I know Zoom can be a little weird, but as you're figuring that out, let's go to Antonio.
Sorry.
No, you're good.
Yeah, mine's just more like a high level question about everything that we're doing, because we're talking about a lot of different programs. So the database is created using Rails, correct? And active record exists within Ruby, and that's so that we can take, convert everything in the database to objects so that we can use that information. And post-to-go that's just a schema, a database schema designer and viewer.
Essentially. So what I would say is that you can create a database, you can create a Postgres database without Rails. That can be completely independent. But what you'll do more often probably is use a Rails command to create a database based on, you know, the things that come with your repo. Basically, when you run Rails new, it'll give you access to commands like Rails DB create. And that's usually what we'll use. We usually will create the database through a Rails command. So that was the first piece. The second piece, yes, we use Active Record to access the data in our database and also convert it into Ruby objects that are easier to work with, and vice versa. We use Active Record to write some Ruby code or some Rails code. It's Ruby code, but we're working in Rails. So we write code in Rails that will then call Active Record methods, which go off and do some operations in our database, whether that's to retrieve or create or edit or whatever.
And sorry, just to, before you continue, so the active record and the way that we're using that is Ruby console, correct?
That is one way that we use Active Record, yes. But you also will use Active Record in your code, right? If you think back to Task Manager, when you did task.create, that was some Active Record, yeah. Okay. But you can do all that stuff in the Rails console as well for one-off things, just to try things out or interact with your models. The other thing I wanted to clarify is that Post-to-Co is, as a software, it is more than just a schema or a visualizer. It can do updates and it can change your database, but we won't be using it that way because it can cause weird behavior. We will be using it just to visualize what's in our database. It's basically like another layer on top of Postgres, just so you can interact with Postgres in a way that's more visually like clear.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Sure. That answered your question. Did I get to everything?
Yes.
Okay. Cool.
Just wanted to make sure I was connecting all the pieces right. So
yeah, no, that's great. And there's a lot of like new terminology, and it's good to clarify like exactly how those pieces fit together. So thank you. Cool. What other questions do y'all have? Okay, if there are no more questions on databases and ORMs right now, if they come up, we can absolutely take them. And if there's no more troubleshooting that you all want to do on that activity, are are there questions that have come up not related to class today? We can also use office hours to clarify project questions or anything else that's on y'all's mind. So just raise your hand if you have any of those too. Sure, Antonio.
Yeah, I was going through the notes from yesterday on the model testing, and we kind of briefly went over the whole describe class, and then right next to that, there's like this type model, and it's optional if it's defined properly in the spec models. Can you be more specific? What do you mean if it's defined in the spec models file? I guess I'm having a hard time understanding when I would need to use type model and when I wouldn't.
Right, good question. What I mean by that is Rails by convention will look at the directory structure to infer certain information about tests and views and stuff like that. So for specs, if Rails notices that you have a spec folder, and then underneath that you have a models folder, and then inside that models folder you have a bunch of spec files, it will infer that those are model specs. So it has to do with your directory structure and the naming of your folders.
So there's nothing like code included in the file that actually specifies that. It's just the fact that it's in that directory and it knows.
Right, unless you are working on a project where this has happened to me, where I have a team and they say, just put all your specs in the same directory, just put them all under spec or whatever. That wasn't exactly how we did it, but essentially there were some feature tests and some model tests at the same level in the directory. And in that case, because they weren't divided up by convention, we needed to add that keyword argument of type feature, type model, type controller, etc. So I think it's much easier to just sort your tests, and that's the way I recommend that we do it in Mod 2, to sort your tests into directories that are named what kind of tests they are. So in this case, models. But if you didn't have that file structure defined, then yeah, you would need the keyword argument to tell our spec in the code, like in the actual spec, what kind of test it is. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. So we probably won't have to deal with that too often. It's just good to know, but.
Yep, exactly.
Okay. Thanks.
And if you want to pass that keyword argument and be super explicit and clear, that's also totally fine. Sure.
Okay.
Oh, I have a question about the Rails generate command.
Okay.
We kind of had issues with that yesterday. So when we went ahead and we started, Michael and I, my partner, we went ahead and we started automatically making the tables that we're going to use for our project, the tables, my tables. And we looked at the documentation as well as like the task manager that we went through. And we figured like, hey, the convention for like the terminal is Rails, generate, migration, like the table name, like the class table name in snake case. And then after that is like the header along with the type of data that it is. So like name equals string. It did not work for us. So when we ran it and we looked at it, we made sure there weren't any typos and anything like that. It did create a migration file, but the migration file was basically empty. All it had was just class. So we started up with game studio, so it had like class, game studio, and then it was inheriting from like application record or forgot which one it was, but it didn't actually have like the define create table, table name, and then like the T dot data types and everything like that. So that didn't work.
Could you share your screen? I have an idea of what you might be able to try, but yeah, you can continue describing. I didn't mean to interrupt, but if you could share your screen and we could all take a look together, I think that would be good.
Well, I was gonna segue into the next part, but I'll go ahead and share my screen anyway. Let's see.
Okay.
So what we ended up doing, we found in a documentation that we could do instead of like Rails generate migration to do Rails generate model. And literally the only thing that we changed like the only thing we changed was we went back to the exact same Rails terminal command that we did, and we just replaced migration with model, and it worked. And then we also had the benefit of it made like the models as well as the spec model, like the empty part of it. I have two questions now that I've explained that. First is, why didn't migration work? And then the second is it good practice, or like at our level, like what we're doing in the project, should we use model, or should we try to stick to migration? And then if there's any problems, manually fill out the migration file as much as possible.
Gotcha. Yeah, excellent questions. I think, maybe some of this will become more clear as we have more classes on it and stuff, but it's great that y'all are looking ahead and exploring and kind of trying to push your knowledge there. So I have a couple of thoughts. Typically, what I recommend, especially for people who are just getting started with Rails, is to go ahead and use a generator for the migration, but then to create the model and the model test manually. And the reason for that is mostly so that you have a really clear understanding and you're building up the muscle memory of what it really takes to get these models all set up in your Rails app. What I don't want people to do is use generators for things that create all kinds of stuff for them and then not be able to speak to what that's doing or why. So an example of that, could you go over to the Game Studio spec that you had open a second ago? And so here we have some stuff that was, I'm guessing you didn't type this out, the pending, add some examples or delete, right? So that's an example of one thing that's going to be automatically generated that, I mean, honestly, you could probably just remove. The other thing that comes to mind is for people getting started with Rails, and it could be like you and your project partner already have a really clear understanding of this, and it's fine for you to use this model generator, but yeah, imagine a world where you have to create a model manually, but you forget to have it inherit from application record, right? And that's something that is taken care of automatically for you, I would guess, with this model generator. As to why the generator for the migration didn't work, I have a guess, but it's hard to say for sure without having your terminal output. But could you, I know I'm putting you on the spot, but could you open up your terminal and like type out, you don't have to run it, but can you type out like how you had the migration generator typed out in your terminal?
Let's see.
Yeah.
And then after that, I had like, or we had like,
yeah. So I think that's probably good enough for this example. Thank you. I think what is happening here is you're generating a migration and you're calling it Game Studios, which makes sense. That's what you're creating. But in Rails, everything is convention over configuration. So the syntax that you would use here to create a really nice, neat migration to actually start your Game Studios, could you get rid of the employee or that thing that you started typing? If you go back to before Game Studios in your Cam or Pascal case, I think if you did this generate migration, create Game Studios, it would actually set up a migration to create the table for you. And we can try it. It's safe to, sorry, that would be also capitalized, like also Pascal case, create Game Studios, all one, yeah.
Oh, okay.
So, and you can delete this right after you run, but do you mind running this command, like just pressing return? And you can delete that file afterwards. But my theory is, oh yeah, no, so it already has a migration called create Game Studio, so it won't work. But yeah, if you did like create gamers, or I don't know.
Yeah. Like game console.
Yeah. So now if you go look at that migration file, you have create table game consoles do T, and then you have your block variable where you can go in here and add like T dot timestamps or T dot integer number of like RAM capacity or whatever you want it to be, right? So I think that's the only thing you were missing from your original generator.
Okay, that was my bad then. My partner was suggesting that and we did not do that, so whoops.
It's okay. I have made the same mistake like a bunch of times. And then why isn't, and then I look at my schema and it didn't create anything and I get all confused because I didn't even slow down and read. But yeah, exactly. I think it just has to do with like the string that you pass it. Again, Rails will try to figure some stuff out based on that. And if you put the create keyword in there, it'll do the create table block for you.
Yeah, because before when we did just like it without the create part, it was giving us that, and that didn't make sense.
Yeah.
But now that does.
Cool. Glad that was helpful. And again, I'll just say, if you feel like confident that you understand everything the generator is creating for when you use a model generator, it's fine with me if you use it, but I would suggest to everybody to at least try to manually create your models once or twice before you use the model generator.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. Oh, Jacob, yes.
I've got a question about the migration as well. So I don't know, I think it's just syntax, but should we be relating the two tables together upon the creation of both? Because I keep getting this error that says, what does it say? It just Rails aborted and errors occurred and the migrations are canceled after. Because I tried to.
Could you share your screen? Yeah.
Yeah.
Continue. Sorry.
So I tried to reference like one table at the end here.
Mm-hmm.
Because I have like the manufacturers and then I have the disk. So I have this, but I was trying to say that I wanted it to pull the foreign key from this table as soon as I created it. Am I thinking about that the right way?
I think so. I think this all looks good, but I agree that maybe there is a maybe there's a syntax error here. Do you mind also pulling up your task manager project? Could you open that like in a different window? Or and what I'm curious about is the migration that you ran in task manager. So create task. Yeah, so if you'll notice on line 3 of that migration, create table tasks is plural. Pluralization will matter a lot in Rails. So I think maybe if you roll back your migrations and you create the table as disk manufacturers plural, then maybe the foreign key reference will take. That would be the first thing I would try.
Okay, I think I did that first, and then I ended up changing it because I still couldn't get it to run, and that was just the first one that I saw. Because I thought maybe I didn't need like the underscore there or something. Let me see if I can find it. Maybe not. Can you talk to me a little bit about the rollback and like just that process?
Sure. Let's actually try this. I'd be interested to see if you get a different error if we change the pluralization. This could be probably valuable for everybody. So rollback, typically you only want to roll back one migration. And if you're rolling back more than one migration, there's probably a better way to accomplish what you're trying to change. But for the sake of, this small example and where you're at in the project, I think it's okay. Let's do Rails DB : so Rails space DB : rollback. And then if you run that, uninitialized constant create disks manufacturer. Do you mind making your text a little bit bigger in your terminal with like Command+? Thank you so much. That's much easier to see. Cool. Let me think about this.
I think this is one that I tried also.
Oh, I see.
So like
Yeah, so you want your class definition that needs to match the name of your migration, if I remember correctly. So if it's plural in the file name, I think you also want it to be plural there on line 1.
okay, so plural here, and then plural here as well.
Sorry, can you expand your file tree a little bit in your text editor? Like, can you pull this out? Yeah. So if you scroll back down to the name of the migration, you have a bunch of numbers and you have create disks plural.
Right.
And then manufacturer singular. So we probably want that to be singular. I think, yeah, let's try the rollback command one more time here. Yeah, so disks manufacturer does not exist. And then as kind of like a check to see like a source of truth, can you open up your schema file, schema.rb underneath db in your text editor? So this is what we have currently. We have disks manufacturers, plural. Okay.
So I need to go back and add an S.
Yes, I think that's right. And then the only place you'll add an S is in the create table. This might be a migration that you want to redo just to make the pluralization very consistent, but let's try just adding it here on line 3 where your cursor is and running the rollback, and we'll see if that like gets you back to a clean slate with nothing defined in your schema. There we go. So now if you click on schema.rb, this will be the update. Nothing's there. Great.
Right.
So now we are basically at a state where you haven't run any migrations. And when you haven't run the migrations, you can edit them. Once you run Rails DB migrate, they are set in stone. The only way to edit them then would be with a rollback. So basically you can think of Rails DB migrate as like sealing the envelope of your migration for like lack of a better analogy. So let's go back to, could you pull up the create disks manufacturer on one side and the create disks on the other side? Great, thank you. So I might take a second here just to like read through these migrations and make sure like the wires in my brain aren't getting crossed. Create table disks manufacturers. So they're both plural. You have a name, location, international, variety of disks, timestamps, and then over here you have the foreign key. So the first thing I'm noticing is that your foreign key on line 10 of create disks, this is not matching up with the pluralization of the other, right? And to be completely honest, I don't remember if this T dot references is supposed to be plural or singular. So we will try both. But while we're here, before we run any migrations, why don't we make sure that your pluralization on the first migration is consistent with like the file name and the create table. So if on create table you have disks manufacturers plural for both, I think that the file name should be plural for both and the class name should be plural for both. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I need to add this and then change this guy.
I think this will work, yeah, if you rename. Cool. Weird. You can't click out of there. Looks like it worked. Cool. Why don't we try a Rails DB migrate at this point and see if it likes what we changed. Okay, now to make sure everything looks the way we want it to look, let's look at the schema, schema.rb. We have disks and they have a disk manufacturer's ID. So I do think that because, sorry, I'm trying to string my words together in a way that makes sense, but because the disks can belong to one disk manufacturer, I think we probably did not want the plural on line 10 of create disks. I think we want that to be disks manufacturer, like the manufacturer is single. So you can say disk manufacturer ID. So what we'll need to do, like I said, we can't change that migration directly because we already ran it, but it's the most recent migration. So it's perfectly safe to run a Rails DB rollback. Okay, and then go over to create disks and you'll take out the S on the disk manufacturers. So now the foreign key refers to one disk manufacturer. I think this is the correct way to do this. Migrations are tricky. I still have to like kind of wrestle with them when I run my own. So
I think I was also trying to change all these plurals like individually after I got the error message too. Like they weren't all different when I first started it. So I just kind of kept trying one thing at a time.
that makes sense. Cool. So now you have your T index disk manufacturer ID. It's indexed on that. And if you scroll all the way to the bottom of the schema file, is that all we have? Okay, yeah. Add foreign key disks and disks manufacturers. That's exactly what I would expect to see.
Cool.
So yeah, I hope that was helpful. The only other thing I'll mention is that I don't know if y'all have gotten this far in your studies yet, but like you can't edit schema.rb directly. It'll do nothing. You have to change it using migrations.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Happy to help.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all.